Hello.
Hey, Simon.
Hey, Simon. It's Skylar. How you doing?
Simon.
Hello, Simon.
What's up, Simon?
Hello.
How you doing?
Hey.
Hello.
Hey,
Simon.
Hello, Simon.
Hello, Simon.
This is Conversations with Storytellers, a podcast of thoughts of folk and fairy tales, wisdom from our elders, and I am your host, Simon Brooks. A meeting with professional storytellers. I decided to travel around the country when I could to interview some of the elders in the community of traditional storytelling, people who, for their work, tell folk and fairy tales, myths and legends. Each storyteller shares their thoughts on our profession and gems of wisdom, and sometimes a story or two. I'm glad that you're here. Eldrena Douma is an elder from the Pueblo people of the Hopi, Tewa and Laguna. Today, living in Texas, she also spends a lot of time between New Mexico and Arizona. Her close upbringing with her family and the folks around her gives her a deep insight into how story goes so deeply within the Pueblo people, in a way I had not realized before. It helped me understand why some first American people do not like their stories being told by folks who are not part of their immediate world and community. This is not just about how deep story is in Eldrena's blood, it's the history of the Pueblo people. We also talk about how Eldrena moved to incorporate this to bring stories of her heritage to others. Eldrena Douma, thank you so much indeed for joining me on this Conversations with Storytellers. I'm very excited to talk to you.
Thank you. I am too. I'm anxious to get to know a little bit more about you.
Oh, this is about you, not me.
Well, I probably will learn something along the way about you.
Probably. So you are Native American, First American. Which title do you prefer, just out of curiosity?
Actually, I come from the Pueblos of the Laguna, the Tewa, and the Hopi.
Okay. All right. So that and that is New Mexico and Arizona, am I right?
Correct.
All right. But you currently reside in Texas, am I right?
Yes, in the panhandle of Texas, right a little bit south of I-40, in between Amarillo and Canyon, Texas.
My wife and I drove over that highway, and I remember looking out of one side of the window and saw this fence coming up towards us, and I looked out the other window on the other side of the car, and it looked like the fence had just gone all the way around the world and come back again. It was so flat.
Yes.
I don't think I've ever been anywhere as flat as that panhandle in Texas.
Yes, and that's how I know that people are just traveling through. When I meet them and they'll say, "Oh, you live in Amarillo, we passed through there. It was so flat." And I said, "Okay, so that means that you didn't stay for very long." And they said, "No, we just passed through it." I said, "Well, usually when you pass through it, you just see nothing but flat, because when I first came to live here, I thought the same thing. And then when I was teaching, I happened to be teaching at a school that was the furthest up north in the Amarillo School District. And I went on just on my own. We weren't required to do it, but I just did it on my own. I went to go visit the families of the kids that I was going to be teaching. And when I went to this one area, I happened to just look back. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm on a hill and I am looking down. How does that happen? Because visually, you don't even see that. It's just the strangest thing. And then, of course, we have the second largest canyon just to the south of Amarillo called Palo Duro Canyon. And that is a gorgeous place too.
Oh, I bet. So my wife, she lived in Albuquerque for a while. And one of the things that we did when we drove across, because we were moving to Portland, Oregon, when we drove across country, we were heading into New Mexico to hang out with some of her friends that she had made when she lived there.
Yes.
And it was interesting because when you got further east, you started to see like little bumps and hills, and then the mesas start to appear, and it does become absolutely gorgeous. And the canyons of that part of America are just amazing, absolutely amazing. So where did you grow up exactly? Where was the beginning of your life?
I was actually born in Winslow, Arizona. And my mom and my dad, that's where they were living. And it kind of all began with them because my mother's people came from New Mexico, and his family came from Arizona. And so when I was growing up, you never think to ask questions. You never think to ask, how did this all happen? And
Right.
then once you get older, you start to figure out pieces around you. And it's all very historical, actually, how their whole life evolved around history. Because um, there was I don't know what year it was, but the Grand Canyon started to hire young Native people in the area. And so they hired them to come and work at the Grand Canyon in all different areas. And so my father went to the Grand Canyon with several of his friends to just go find a job because they heard about it. And so he was doing odd jobs. He was kind of working in, I think, a little shop, and they might have, he might have been doing mechanical stuff. I mean, he did a lot of odd jobs. And if I have a chance, I'll tell a little bit of a story about a tourist that came and just started up conversation with him. And then he ended up wanting my father to be his tour guide. And that was not my father's position. So anyway, I don't know who this man was, but somehow he talked to my father's supervisor. And for that one day, maybe more, but Dad was just talking about that one day, he was his tour guide. And I thought, wow. And you hear those stories, you don't know what kind of questions to ask, but hindsight, looking back, that is one of the things that I wished I would have asked more questions on is, Dad, who was this man to where he went to your supervisor and, got your supervisor to allow you to be a tour guide when that wasn't your position? I mean, and he must have been a good, either he paid something or he
Yeah, right.
I don't
That's
know.
what I was thinking.
Yes, but anyway, so that's a story that my dad, and then it goes on. There's some more to that story, but then my mother was in high school at Winslow, and this all took place during the summer months. And so her sister had contacted her, came home and said to her, why don't you come back with me to the Grand Canyon, because they need workers there, and I think you could get on as a worker. So she said, well, I don't know if Mom and Dad would let me go, because I think that was her junior year. And her sister said, well, and she talked some more about her, and I think she convinced my mom that that it was a good thing to do. And so she said, well, you might have to go ahead and ask Mom and Dad for me, because I don't think they'll let me go if I ask. So my aunt asked permission, and they said, okay, as long as you're going to be there, you take care of her, you watch her and everything like that, and she can go. So my mom started work at the Grand Canyon. And I was just, at that time when I found out, I said, oh, Mom, I said, so what did you do? And she said, well, I first worked at the Bright Angel Lodge. And what we did is we cleaned rooms and everything. And then the next summer I went back, they put me in the laundry room. And then, we just washed all of the linens for the rooms and hotels and everything like that. And I asked her, I said, so what was your favorite job? And she said, I would have to say the Bright Angel Lodge. And I asked, why? She said, because at the Bright Angel Lodge, whenever we got to take breaks or have lunch, they had an area there in the restaurant that all of us kids could sit at. And so no matter where we were working at the Bright Angel Lodge, we came together. And that's how we got to know one another and what tribe everyone was from, and how did they get there, and who are they. And so it was, I guess she liked that personable part of it. And she said,
Yeah.
when I worked at the laundromat, she said, we didn't have anything like that. We just kind of were all kind of on our own. They didn't have an area where we could all gather together. And so she said, I would have to say the Bright Angel Lodge. And she said, and I liked making beds, and I liked cleaning. I like cleaning rooms. And she said, and I thought to myself, yes, I can vouch for that, because when I was growing up, I mean, she had me making those beds to where those sheets were tight. And, before fitted sheets and all of that came. And she didn't have a laundry room. So when I was growing up, we had to boil our water, and we had the galvanized tubs that she had a little room off to the side from the kitchen. And those tubs would be in there. And then we had the washboards that we had to wash the clothes by hand.
Wow.
And then the two of us she would say, Eldrena, hold on to this side of the clothes. And she would twist it so we could wring out as much water. And then we'd take them outside. She'd put them in a basket. We'd go outside together, and we'd hang clothes together on the clothesline. And so that was something that we did. And of course, once we were done washing, we had to empty out the water and take it. And it was a lot of work, and it took all day. And then, of course, once the clothes dried, you bring them in. And Mom liked to iron her linens. So early on, I was like, she would put them in the basket, and right before we would iron, she would sprinkle it with water, and I think it had a little bit of starch in it or something. And then she was teaching me how to iron certain things. You know what? It's the funniest thing, because now when I iron, it's almost meditative to me. I don't iron like I don't, unless I really have to. But if I'm just ironing, I just really enjoy the detailed part of it, getting those little things ironed. And maybe, in a strange way, it takes me back to that simple time in my life when it wasn't so busy. And because when I was younger, that whole era of my time, because was really, when I think back on it, and I've thought back on it a lot lately, but I just remember the quietness of life. I'm sure the rest of the world was not as quiet, but in my world, it was very simple. When I was younger, born in Winslow, and then my dad, after he left the Grand Canyon, he went ahead and got a job with the Santa Fe Railroad. And the same aunt that got my mom the job in Grand Canyon, she met a Hopi man from a different village than my mom. My dad was Tewa and Hopi, and my uncle was Hopi. And so he got a job with the Santa Fe Railroad. So my aunt and him got married, so that when my mom and my dad got married, he said, why don't you come and work for the Santa Fe Railroad? They're looking for workers. So he got my dad a job working with the Santa Fe Railroad. And
now, were these freight trains?
Yes.
Or okay.
Yeah, they were. They all had different jobs. Some of them worked on like the crew that laid the tracks or took care of them.
Oh, okay.
And then some of them were. They would be the painters. They would paint the bridges or anything that needed to be painted, signs, whatever. And the main hub was based out of Winslow, Arizona. And so right next to the train track was where the Santa Fe Railroad, well, I say Santa Fe, it may have been built when they were I can never say that word, Atchison's Railroad, and Santa Fe. But they built a community there for the Laguna workers. Laguna being in New Mexico, Winslow being in Arizona. When the railroad was coming through the Southwest, they had had to get permission from the tribes in New Mexico to come through their land, because they were using not only their land, but they were also going to be tapping into the water source for whatever they
Right.
need. So they had to have permission. They did not know that until the government there in New Mexico told them, well, you can't just, come right through. You're going to have to, the area that you're planning to go through is through tribal lands. And so you're going to have to go to their government and ask permission for you to go through. So
wow. I didn't think the American government did such things. Sorry, I'm very jaded about that sort of stuff.
Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe not the U.S., but the state of New Mexico. They basically said, yeah, you can come through here, but on your information there, you're going through some tribal lands. You're going to have to go there. So they did. They went there, and they went through the what back then they called it the San Domingo tribal lands, but today a lot of the Pueblo tribes are going back to their original names, because the Spaniards changed their names when they came into the
right. Yes.
And so today, when you go back among the Southwest Indians in particular, and I think others are doing it too, you'll go back and you will see their name changing on signs and stuff. So today you might see the sign Tewa, because that's the name of the San Domingo Pueblo people. Their original name is Tewa. And then Laguna, their original name is Skoek. So that is their name. Laguna was just given to us by the Spaniards. So that was the name that they placed on the people. And since it was documented, then from that point on, everybody referred the Skoek people as Lagunas. And so that's how we got those names. And then if you look throughout New Mexico, a lot of the tribes there, they have Spanish names. And that was from the time that the Spaniards came to the land, and kind of just.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, because I think, I think with Lagunas, because there was water around the area, and that is what Laguna refers to. That's how they came up with the name for the people there. And then the others, when they started to build their missions on the tribal lands, whatever mission or saint, that might have something to do with what they named them. So
it's amazing, like how colonialism reaches so deeply into the cultures that were already existing. And I think we all realize that. And when I say we, I mean, the Western Europeans. Being English, I've read a lot of my history, and we weren't very good mentors for the rest of the world. That's for sure. In a lot of what we did.
Yeah, the thing about it is that when you look back, and I think myself as a Native woman, as a Pueblo woman, I grew up with just the way the world was at the time. My family grew up like that too, but yet they had a close connection to our culture and our traditions. And that was one of the things that happened when they started to build the community for the Santa Fe workers in Winslow, is they realized early on that in order to keep the workers doing a good job and not getting homesick, they had to build a community that brought their families to them. And
so it wasn't necessarily forward thinking, or it wasn't for altruistic reasons. It was more for keeping people there for profit and loss reasons, by the sound of it.
Yeah, and because there were traditions that were taking place throughout the year in the motherland, basically back at their traditional homelands. And so it didn't make sense to them to miss out on these ceremonies that were so much a part of their lives. And so anyway, what happened was Santa Fe with all of the workers from Laguna, wherever they were working at, like say for instance, they're in Albuquerque, in Gallup, in Winslow, and then there were two others in California, and they all had these little communities, and they called them the Laguna Colony, is what they called it. And
Okay.
so our people were the first ones, probably some of the first ones, if not the first ones, that were actually living in the railroad cars. Now they're selling them for people to build houses, little tiny houses.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, back then that was their house. Those were their houses. They went ahead and got these empty cars and placed them in rows, and then the people, they made houses out of them. And so
oh wow.
Yeah, and then they connected them with construction in between. So they were like in rows. Families lived in rows. So like for instance, my grandmother and them, my grandfather was working there, so my grandma and the children went to go live there, and that was kind of where my mom was raised up. And all that time I thought my mom was raised up back at Laguna, and then when she got older she went to Winslow. But then when I started to hear her stories, she was talking about going to school there in elementary and then junior high and graduate, or going to Winslow High School. So she lived there longer than I thought she did. And all of that culture was brought with them. So throughout,
that's so neat.
Yeah. So throughout they even elected their own officials. So like back at the original homeland of Laguna, you have your governor, your lieutenant governor, your war chiefs, and then every village has their own officers. And so they have village meetings. That today, I don't know about back then, but today they have like a village meeting where their officers and the people come together for a meeting at their village once a week. And then the officers of every village, they come together with all the other officers throughout the week. And so there is discussion on, what's going on here and there, what needs to get voted on. This is what the people are saying. This is what we're going to vote for. This is not what we're going to vote for. So there's that discussion that happens constantly throughout the week. And then when the village meetings take place, then the officers take the information back to the people of the villages and tell them what was discussed. And then they can discuss it among themselves, because at Laguna we have 6 villages. Mm-hmm. And they're all different, even though we're all Lagunas, depending on where their village is located, determines a lot of decisions that are going to be different than the other villages. So there's a lot of...
Is this based on topography and resources and that kind of stuff?
Yes, that too. Yes. And then this kind of like, the beliefs of the villages themselves. Like there's one village that does not allow women to come to their meetings, but there are other villages that do allow the women to come to their meetings. So they can determine that on their own, because they're their own tribal entity of their village. And so they're given, they continue to have the ability to make decisions for their own people of their own village, even though they live in a bigger space. So
yeah.
So that is a rare thing, because a lot of the other pueblos in New Mexico, they might not have all of the same thing that Laguna has. They might not have all those villages, so there's not a lot of decisions that have to take place. I mean, well,
Gotcha.
there's still a lot of decisions that have to take place, but it might not take that long, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Because there are less people. Well, units to talk about. Yeah.
So what happened then when all of these colonies were along the railroad with the Laguna people? They were like a extended village. So not only Laguna had the 6 villages that they had back home in New Mexico, but now they have these satellite villages that have their own officers that are staying in communication with the main village. And, think about it, because they didn't have access to cell phones. And even the phone at the time cost.
That's what I was going to say. Did they have phones back then? I mean, my wife comes from a fairly rural part of New York State, and one of her family members was the first one to have the phone put in. Nobody else on that street had a telephone, which to kids these days must be like, what? How can that be? Right? And that's a wired telephone. There's no like Snapchatting on those things.
Yes. Well, and it was the same, that only a few people had phones. And so if you needed to make a phone call, sometimes they would say, well, you can use it, but I need to charge you because it's going to cost me money for you to call.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, I remembered when we moved back to Laguna. I'm sorry. Let me just take you through my journey then. So from Winslow, my parents got divorced, and my dad went to go back and live on the Hopi lands at First Mesa, is where he came from a village called Palo. And so he is Tewa and Hopi. So he went back to go live, and he lived with his mother. And then my mother stayed at Winslow for a while, and she met another person, and that she and her next husband ended up going back to New Mexico, taking us kids with them. And so that's kind of how we left Arizona and went back to New Mexico. And then there was several years where I stayed with my dad and my grandmother, and my brothers stayed back at Laguna. And then there was a time when all of us, my 2 brothers and myself, there was a time where we all lived at Palo together. And then they went back to Laguna. So there was this in and out of between New Mexico and Arizona in my life. And then when I became a junior high student, 7th grade, one of my brothers kind of made a decision for me, or I wouldn't say he made a decision. He brought up something to my dad, and he asked my dad if I could come back to Laguna and live with them. And he said, because even though, you and mom are not together, I want my sister to be with us so that we won't keep being separated from each other. And he asked my dad's permission if I could do that. And I felt really bad because now I'm in the middle, and I love my brothers. I don't know Laguna that much, but I love my brothers. And I'm with my dad and my saya. Saya means grandmother in the Tewa language. So I'm living with my saya and my dad. They don't have a lot. But one of the things that I think back on is, why did I enjoy being there so much when they had so little? And I think it was because what they had was the most precious, and that was time. They had time for me. I was the only young person living with them. So they gave me everything of who they were. They gave me their stories. They gave me their songs. I was able to witness 2 great artists that I didn't even think about because it was just so much a part of my world. But my grandmother came from a wonderful pottery family that is renowned throughout the world, and I didn't even know that. Her mother was known as the one that helped to revive the Hopi pottery into what it is today. And her name was,
Really?
yes, her name was Nempeyu. And so that was her mother. And she would tell me things about what they would do and places they would go, and, how her mother traveled and people came after her, and how they would go to the Grand Canyon, and the Hopi House that's at the Grand Canyon was where they would live when my great grandmother was asked to go there to make pottery at the Grand Canyon. They lived up in the Hopi House. And so she would talk about that, but she didn't tell me how old she was. And she was just a little girl when that happened. And so one day I happened to take my children to the Grand Canyon. We went into the gift shop, and I told them, I said, you see this house on top of the gift shop? They call it the Hopi House. That's where my Saya and her mother and them, they lived up there, and they made pottery. Of course, it was closed off to tourists because, it's so much, it's old and stuff now. So, so I could only point to it and say that's where my grandmother and them lived when they came to work here at the Grand Canyon. And then we went into the gift shop, and I just happened to be twirling around the postcard rack, and they had some big pictures, 8x10. And there's a picture of my great grandmother and her family sitting out in front of the Hopi House. And I said, kids, I said, look, this is your great grandmother and your great grandmother. And so I said, this is, well, actually, yeah, it might be more greats than that. And so I went ahead and bought them. And then later on, I found those same pictures in books that I had come across. And so, I still have them to this very day. But
you have one of those books on your website, right?
Yeah, well, it's just one of these things that you come across, and all of a sudden, all those stories that you had heard about, they come to life, and then you realize that this is the place where my parents met. That's the place. That lodge right there was in the story that my father told. Bright
It's
Angel
living
Lodge,
history.
yeah, Bright Angel Lodge is where my mom worked. The laundromat, and then they've made changes since that time. But when you think about the fact that my great grandmother walked those lands, my grandmother walked those lands, my father and mother walked those lands, it's almost like you're just surrounded with history and you don't even realize it. And so here I was growing up at Palaka, Arizona, and my Saya had a house that had 2 rooms. The main room was the living room in the daytime, and at night it turned into our bedroom. And then off to the side was a little kitchen. It had a little table that had enough room for four chairs, but a lot of people always came to visit. So we always, brought in chairs and just placed them around, and a lot of laughter. And then the outhouse, they didn't have running water. And they put in a propane stove for her to cook on. And then eventually electricity came into her house. And then eventually water was brought into her house. So
she was drinking well water at that time then?
Yes. We had, I remember when we were little, we were still living in Winslow at the time, that my dad would take us there to visit, because it was probably about a 45-minute drive from Winslow to the Hopi lands where he lived. And I remembered going after buckets of water at the well with my Saya, and she lived kind of up on top of a little hill. Well, the buckets that I would carry, I was sloshing so much out. By the time I got to the top, I didn't hardly have any water. And
well, you were probably really small, and it was probably one of those buckets, metal buckets with that thin wire handle, right?
Yes.
Which cuts into your hand. So
yes.
Yeah, of course you were slopping it all over the place.
Yeah, and I'm sure I wanted to help. I wanted to help. So it's like, give her a bucket. And, they probably knew exactly what was going to happen by the time I got to the top. But that was
I could just see you with that bucket, like right up against your chin, trying to carry that thing.
I think they gave me 2, so it would balance.
Oh, really? Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. So I would carry 2. Of course, I'm sure they probably just filled it up halfway or something. But I can still remember that, though. I remember going
That's
down to
amazing.
the well. I remembered where the well was, and everybody in that area would all come to the well, and we would be waiting for the next person to get water and the next person. And so sometimes we would meet up with other people there, and then other times it was just us going to get water. So, and then when the water started to come into the people's houses, then you didn't see anybody that much after that. But my saya, she continued.
Oh, is that because the well was kind of like a social place where people would meet, or?
It probably just became that. It just became that. My saya, I remembered her telling me that when they lived on top of the mesa at the Tewa village, that's kind of how she met her husband. Eventually became her husband. She would go down to the spring to get water in the pottery container.
Wow.
And so she would go down there, and she told me one time, because I asked her, I said, how did you meet Grandpa? And she sat there and thought about it. And she had been a widow for a while at that time. And she said, well, one day I went to go get some water at the spring. And when I was there, nobody else was there. There was just me. She said, sometimes you would go there and other women were already there, coming or going or waiting for getting to fill up their pottery. But this time I was by myself. And she said that I felt like somebody was following me. And when I was sitting there getting the water, I felt like, somebody was looking at me, and she wasn't really sure. And she said, in me, I didn't want to look around. I didn't want to look, but I finally did. And that was your grandpa. And she said, I scolded him. I said, what are you doing here? Because it sounded like the men were not supposed to be in that area. It was kind of like for the women. And so, he had told her that he wanted to talk to her. And that was the only place where he could get her to talk to. And she was just so concerned at the fact that he was there and he was male. I don't want to talk to you. I've got to get the water. Well, he stayed with her, and I don't know if he helped her carry the pottery water up or what. But anyway, in that time, they carried on a conversation. And she said to me, and then he came right there next to me. And I was telling him, don't, go away. You shouldn't be here. And he was talking. And she said, I was getting my water, and he said to me, he called her name. And she turned to look at him when he called, and he was right there. And he gave her a kiss. And she said, and I was just laughing as she's telling this story, because it's almost like she's reliving this thing all over again. And she said, I screamed, and I said, ew, and she said, don't be doing that. And she said, I got the water, and I was washing my mouth. I was washing my lips. And I said, Sayao, why would you do that when he kissed you? And she said, no. She said, I don't know what he's been putting in his mouth, and he put it on mine. And she said, it's just nasty. And I started laughing, and I said, Saya, you mean, did he not kiss you when you became husband? No, she said, I told him, I don't want you to be kissing me. She said, because I see what you are eating and I see what you're putting in your mouth. I don't want that on my lips, she would say.
Oh, wow.
But anyway, I started laughing at that. And then, but it made sense to me. I said, this is weird, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah, right. It does.
But,
wow.
But
he was
story.
bold. He was bold. I imagine that your mom was a bit of a she was in control of her life, and she was
Well,
like,
yeah, this was my grandma, my
yeah,
dad's
yeah,
mom. Yeah.
yeah.
But she was also be considered like a midwife, and she kind
Okay.
of she kind of worked on people. Like if, people were saying my arm has been hurting me, I thought I'd come to you to see if you can rub it, and those were the terms that they used a lot. So as a little girl, I didn't see all the details of the things that my grandmother, how she put things together, how she made the poultice or the drinks that she had them drink. But I remember sitting there and she would rub certain places in their bodies, and sometimes she could tell where they might have dislocated a part of their shoulder or their elbow or something like that. And she would talk to them and tell them that she's getting ready to put it back in place. And so I remember just seeing those, every now and then. And so that was when I was in elementary age. And then I went, and my father told my brother, I can't make that decision for your sister. She's going to have to make that decision whether to go back with you or not, which I thought was very smart. But it put me in a place where I had to make a choice. I wanted to be with my brothers. I miss them so much. But at the same time, the life with my father and my grandmother, even though it might have not been many years, just that short period of time impacted me so much that when I became a professional storyteller, that's where I went to go back. I went back into that world of living with my Saya and my dad, because that was my storytelling world. That was where I remembered and I could visually see the things that they were telling me, because it was a constant. We didn't have any distractions. We didn't have a TV. And I know we had a radio, because when we would eat lunch, my dad and my Saya liked to listen to a radio station that came on at noontime. And there was a Navajo radio person and a Hopi radio person, and they would do back to back. And they liked listening to both of them. And they not only talked about what was going on in the homelands of both of their people, but they also brought songs from the Dene people and the songs of the Hopi. And they were both humorous men. The ones that were the radio announcers and stuff, they were humorous. And my grandmother and my father would just be sitting there, and they would just laugh. And I would say, what is he saying? What is he saying? Oh, they're talking about this. I said, but what's so funny? And then they would tell me, well, this is what he said. I said, oh, okay. And so I think a lot of me, I don't know if I was an observer at birth or if I learned to become an observer. But because a lot of languages were being spoken around me and I didn't know those languages, I kind of would watch the people and look at the expressions and watch their body language. And sometimes I could figure things out.
Yeah, I totally get that. Yeah. So these radio hosts, they were talking their own language. They were talking in Hopi and Navajo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so they're very different from each other.
Right. Yeah. And what was your father and your Saya's language? What did they speak?
The mother language was Tewa.
Okay.
And then Hopi came next.
Okay. And then your mother, what language did she speak?
She spoke the Goek language, the Laguna language.
Okay. Wow. Mm-hmm. And so what did you speak naturally growing up, other
English.
than English?
English. Oh. But when it was funny because English, but then when we had our own house in Winslow, but we would go and visit my grandma at the Laguna Colony there at Winslow. So we lived on the eastern side of Winslow, and the colony was on the western side of Winslow. So either we would walk or my grandpa would come and pick us up in his truck and take us back over there. Or when my dad and them had a car, then, we would drive over there. But I spent a lot of time at the colony with everybody. So the Laguna language was being spoken, the songs were being sung, the traditions of the people were carrying on. It was almost like they just picked up a little portion of Laguna and brought it to Winslow. And
That's so neat.
Yeah, so the people that lived there continued on like they were back home.
Right. And did you pick up Laguna? I mean,
Laguna is probably, out of the three languages of the Laguna, the Tewa and the Hopi, the one that comes the easiest to me in listening and in just saying the word is Tewa.
okay.
Laguna is very hard for me, but now that I'm getting older, I'm starting to be able to make the sounds better. They have, I don't even know how to describe it. There is so much sound that takes place in placement of the tongue and the teeth and everything in your mouth that goes on, that if you make a slight mistake, you could be saying something, not so nice,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
or something that doesn't make sense, because it's like, no, you say this. And it's kind of like, I thought I said that. No, you
right.
said this.
Yeah.
This is what, and so.
I hear, yeah.
Yeah, and then Hopi, I love listening to the Hopi people talk, but it wasn't something that I was surrounded by growing up, because both Lagunas and the Tewa and Hopi are matrilineal people. So we always refer to the mothers first before the father's side. So in my Saya's house, because her mother was Tewa, so she's Tewa, and then Hopi comes next with her children. And my Saya was Tewa and Hopi, so she spoke Tewa, but she knew Hopi fluently, and my dad did too. So when they had a Hopi visitor, they spoke Hopi, and then when the visitor left, they spoke Tewa. And so if a Tewa and a Hopi came in the door together, then they would speak Hopi.
Okay, because that's the visitor's language.
Mm-hmm. And
that's so respectful. I love that. That is so cool.
But it also goes back to a traditional story, and that is how.
Do you want to share that story?
Well,
can you share that story?
Yeah, I think so. It's something that my Saya had told me. At First Mesa is where this story takes place.
Okay.
And in Hopi, there are other mesas. There's Second Mesa, and then they have a village by Tuba City, Muntkopi, and I don't know if they refer to that as Third Mesa, but so this story is only at First Mesa. It doesn't involve the other Hopis, because and actually it mainly talks about how the Tewas came to live among the Hopis. And so you're getting a Tewa point of view.
Okay.
You're getting the Tewa side of the story. The Hopis may have their story about how the Tewas came, but this was a story that my Saya had told me, and I'm not going to go into detail about it, but it was just basically a little bit about why we were there, because I just assumed as a little girl going to the day school that we always lived there. I mean, every time I came home, they were there. I learned about Nempeo being Tewa and Hopi, and so she lived there. And so I just assumed that we had always been there. I never even thought about us being anywhere else. And then one day I remembered the kids had teased us here and there. I never thought anything of it. And one time I went down to the trading post, um, like our little grocery store back then. My grandmother and my dad, whenever they finished their pottery and their cachinas, they would take it to the trading post, and they would get money for their pots and their cachinas, and then they would either buy groceries or clothes or whatever was necessary. And if they had any money left over, they would just save it and maybe use it in Winslow or Holbrook. And so anyway, one time I went down there, and I remembered people used to post little signs here and there advertising stuff. And so I went there one time, and I remembered I went to go visit a relative that lived in that area. We just walked all over. We just walked all over to visit everybody. And I was one to do that. And I remember seeing a sign, and all it said was Tewas go home. And I thought, I wonder why somebody would say Tewas go home. And it was there, and I read it, and I just carried on. I didn't think anything of it. And then it started to come up a little bit more. And then at school, some of the kids started to tease a group of us Tewas, which, we're Tewa and Hopi, but more Tewa. And they said, you Tewas, you don't belong here. You should go home. And I thought, well, we can't go home. It's school. They'll get mad at us if we leave school. So that's where I thought that's what they meant. You Tewas need to go home. It's like, well, we're not going to go home. It's school time. They're going to get mad at us if we go home. I said, no, you need to get out of here. You don't live here. You're not from here. And I still didn't understand that thought. When I went home, I asked my grandmother about it. I said, Saya, at school, some of the kids are talking like this. And I told her the situation. And she just kind of sat there, and she looked at my dad, and my dad just sat there and kind of nodded his head too. And so, we had dinner, and when we got everything cleaned up, we always went into the living room, bedroom area and relaxed there. And my Saya said, Drina, she said, when you were talking about what went on today at school, I want to tell you a little bit about us Tewas. So I said, okay. Now my Saya, she had broken English. And so sometimes my dad would have to tell her something in Tewa so she could understand it a little bit better. Even though she was in the world, because she sold her pots at museums and all these places. So she was in communication with other English speaking people, but she was just more fluent in the languages that she spoke. So she sat there, and she just basically told me that we were not originally from that place in Arizona. She said, we came from where your mother's people in New Mexico, in that area. We are Tewas from the northern part of where your mother and them live. And she told me the place, and I don't remember it, but it historically it's kind of talked about. And they said that we come from a people that are good fighters, and we're warriors. And so we were some of the ones that went up against the Spanish people that came to the land long time ago. And she said that so we were known for our fighting abilities. Even though we're peaceful people, we don't jump into a fight, basically. But if fighting has to happen, then we were the ones that knew how to do it, and we were good at it. So she said, after everything had kind of calmed down, the Hopis were having struggles here at First Mesa. The only village that was here was Walpi. That was the only village on the southern end of the mesa. And when you actually look at First Mesa, an aerial view, if you look down on it, it looks like a long ship, a wide, long ship.
Okay.
And so the Hopi village, or the Walpi village, was on the southern end, and then nothing the rest of the way. So when the Tewas came, they gave them the place on the northern end of that mesa. So that's why it's called the Tewa village. And then eventually, when the Hopis and the Tewas married together, they came and built houses in the middle. And basically, in Tewa, or Hopi Tewa, it's called Middle Village. And so there's a variety. But you have your Tewas on the north, your Hopis on the south of this mesa, and in the middle is intermarriage between the two. So anyway, she said that the Hopis had come to their place to ask if they would come to live with them at their place, because they had been raided on. A lot of the more nomadic tribes that were coming through, they would attack them. And the Hopis are known for their peacefulness. They don't jump into fighting. They are more of a prayerful people. They seek peace before war. And so they're not, at that time, they were not aggressive. And so they started to think about themselves, and, if these people keep coming at us, eventually we're not going to be here, pretty much. So we need to get somebody to help us, to protect us. So they sought the Tewas. How they decided that they were the ones, and where to go to get this particular group, I don't know. But Saya said that they had come and they found them. They talked to their leader. He said, I can't send my people to a place that we don't really know anything about and expect them to go. So I'm going to have to say no about it. And I think Saya said that the Hopi men that came, that made that journey, they stayed a while. They tried to convince them, but no answer. So they went back. And now different stories say different things, but Saya didn't tell me how many times they went back. She didn't go into those kind of details, but the details are there among the Tewa. She just said that eventually they made a decision, a group of them, not all of them, but a group from that people decided that we're going to take our families and go help the Hopis. So before they took off, though, Saya said that the Hopi men that came, they promised their leaders that the Hopis would take care of this group of people. They would give them a place to live, teach them how to live off their land, provide for them while they're establishing themselves, because they're leaving their homeland. They have nothing. So that was the promise, and they said that was what would happen. So the families took off, and I don't know how many months, how many years of a trek it was, because that's coming from even northern part of Santa Fe, north of Santa Fe, going all the way across into what is now the Hopi land of First Mesa. That's a long ways. So they stopped along the way. And even to this day, I remembered my relatives saying that sometimes the men would make the trek back in the places where they had been, just to retell and to teach the young ones where they had come from and where they stopped along the way. And so I didn't know that until I was
That's cool.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
It only happened with the men. It never really had anything to do with the women. So the men were the ones that would do this. And so I had really no reason to know that. But my Saya said that once they got there, they did handle the people that were attacking. They made sure that the nomadic tribes that were coming through and attacking, they made sure that from that point on, that they knew that the Tewas were there, and that the Tewas were good warriors. They allowed some to live and some and many to die. But the ones that they allowed to live, they allowed them to live so that they could go back to their people and tell them that they were there and that they were going to be there to protect the Hopis. So if they came, they would lose their life. So basically, just warning you, don't come. And so, everything calmed down. Everything became a little bit more peaceful. The Tewas were given that piece of part of the mesa, but they were not being taken care of the way it was promised. And so my Saya said that they had the Tewa people had come together because they thought, well, they're not gonna take care of us, so maybe we need to just get our things and move on. And the Hopis somehow found out about it. Their leadership, they came together and they were asking, why are they leaving? They said, well, you promised our leader that this is what you were going to do if we did what we did, and you're not doing it. So therefore, we're going to leave because apparently we're not wanted, so we're going to move on. And that panicked the Hopis, because it's like, well, if you leave, then they're going to come back again. And it's like, well, then that's your problem. So
that's what happens when you renege.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like, so they were apparently now, mind you, my Saya is telling me this in a whole different way, and I'm just telling you, just very kind of on the surface type of thing. But when the Hopis found out, their leadership found out about it, they had discussions on what did they need to do in order for them to stay. So my Saya said, they both sides prayed about it, because you don't just jump into a decision without praying about it. Both groups were very prayerful people. The Tewas are known for their power of prayer. Many tribes along the way, and this was something that was told to me by someone that found out that I was a Tewa from Arizona. And one of the things that he said to me, he said, I remembered my grandfather telling me about your people. And he said, one of the things that my grandfather told me is those Tewas, their prayers are very powerful. And I said, oh, and he goes, yes. And he says, so my grandfather told me some stories about your people. And he said, they carry powerful prayers. And then I thought to myself, I believe that. I feel like, I've sensed that many times. But anyway, so what they ended up coming down to was they met in the middle of the mesa. They met in the middle, and there's a specific place that's up there. And probably not very many, there's just probably a few people that know about it. But there's a place up there that they dug a hole. And now, mind you, this mesa is like rock. It's like a big rock up there. So they must have really, chiseled into that rock or found a sandy spot or something. But anyway, they came together and did their ceremony, and they told the Hopi leaders to spit in this hole. And I mean, they had to. That was part of it. So they did. And the Tewas, whoever was in that leadership role, they spit on top of it, and then they covered it up. And so the Hopis, asked, why did this take place? And basically the answer was, we will stay here among your people. We will do what we said we were going to do. We will live up to our part. But you did not do what you said you were going to do. And so because of this, we have covered up our language from you. we will get to know and we will learn the language of the Hopi, but you won't learn the language of the Tewa. And
Wow.
so we have covered it up. And so my Saya said, she told me where it was, and it's been so long ago. When I was younger, I knew exactly what she was talking about because uh, we I just knew. And so, but now if I went back there, I'm not sure if I would even be able to point it out or know where it was. But
Oh, I bet you would. I bet you would.
yeah,
I
I
bet
have no idea.
you get some spider sense going off
Yeah.
on there, and you'd find it.
Yeah, I remembered that they used to visually have something, but I don't think it's there anymore. So yeah, I have no idea. Anyway, so my Saya said that is why whenever whenever we raise up our families, we Tewa women, if we were to marry a Hopi man, our children are raised up Tewa. They will learn a little bit about their father's ways or their Hopi mother's way. But if our Tewa boys marry a Hopi woman, then their children are raised up Hopi. And so,
Okay, yeah.
so there, whenever they had anything to do with the ceremonies, like the boys, if they went to help their father that was Hopi in their Hopi ceremonies, they knew to keep them separate. They just knew to keep them separate. And
Right.
so at first, when I heard that story, and she said, and that's why they're saying Tewas go home, because this place was not originally our place. We come from the east. We come from what they now know as New Mexico. And so I said, oh, but after she told me the story, I walked a little bit different. I stood a little bit different.
Did you stand taller?
Huh?
Did you stand taller?
Yeah.
Because you knew that your people helped the Hopi people?
Yeah. And not only that, but we were there and we kept our side of our word, and that that we were still there. And even though, and I was brought up, like my Saya would say, even though we may be treated in not a nice way, that is something that they have to deal with.
Yeah.
We have to keep our promise, and we have to be the people that we are. And so, it was almost like keeping your word.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's so cool.
And
thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Yeah, we kept our word all this time, and we're still here, even though they're still trying to push us out, even though they're still trying to tell us to go. We have been there, and so, and I said, well, Saya, I said, if somebody comes to attack again, will the Tewas rise up? And she said, yes. She said, we are the warriors. We are the protectors of this place. And so I thought to myself, because there is a story about a Tewa warrior girl. And so anyway,
really?
I a little bit different. And so when they said, Tewas go home, I think in the back of my head, I'm thinking, no, you really don't want us to go home.
You need us.
Yeah, you don't know this, but yeah, we're here for a reason. And so anyway, when I was younger, though, I thought to myself, well, that's just a story. It might have made sense, but today that doesn't make sense, because how could one group not know anything about the other group? How could the Hopis that live here not learn the language of the Tewa?
Yeah.
Because they're right here. They're living together. They're intermarrying. How does that not happen? And so, because I've always been a curious little girl, I went to visit my aunt and my uncle. My aunt, of course, is Tewa Hopi, and my uncle was Hopi. So I went to my uncle and I asked him, I said, Uncle, Kaya told me this story, but it doesn't make sense to me because you and Uncle live together. Surely you know how to speak Tewa. And he said, no, because he was an older man. And I said, Uncle, how could you not know how to speak Tewa? And he said, well, let me tell you. Whenever you people are here, you Tewa people are at our house. When I'm not here, what language do you speak when you're at my house? And I said, Tewa. And he said, have you noticed that when I come home and I step into the house, what language is spoken? Hopi? He says, yes. When I'm here, Hopi is spoken. When I'm not here or any other Hopi is here, you people speak Tewa. And I said, yeah, but you have babies and you do things in the kivas and stuff. How is it that, you know, and he said, no, he said, your cousins, if they take part in Tewa, that is not for me to know. And he said, it only makes sense. I am not Tewa. Why would I have to know something that I am not a part of? And he said, so it only makes sense for me to know Hopi because that's who I am. I am not Tewa. I don't need to know what the Tewas do because that is not who I am.
Wow.
At that moment in time, it made sense. And so that also speaks to the stories that, you know, many times when I go to festivals or in the past, they have panels and people ask the native speakers, you know, about, is it okay for us to tell Native American stories? You know, we think it is because we can tell everybody else's stories in the world. You know, why can't we tell their stories? And so it kind of goes back to that.
Yeah.
You know, now that I'm thinking about it, it kind of goes back to what my uncle was saying. I am not Tewa.
Yeah.
I am Hopi. Why would I want to know that? Because that's not the world that I live in. And so even though he lives with them, everything that he did and everything that he addressed was Hopi.
Right.
You know, so he wasn't included.
That's really interesting. I mean, you know, on an intellectual level here, I totally get that. But I also think that nowadays, you know, so the only comparison that I have as somebody that was raised in the UK is I can closely identify with Wales because when my mother and father divorced, my father moved to South Wales. So I have a half brother and a half sister who lived in South Wales. My half brother still does. So I spent a lot of time over the border, and you could walk into a shop, and you would hear the women talking in the shop or the guys talking in the shop. They'd be talking in English, but as soon as you walked in, if they didn't recognize you, they'd suddenly switch into Welsh, right? Because they didn't want me to hear their stories. They didn't want me to understand, right? They just assumed that I was English, right? Which to me was like, when I first experienced that, I think I was like 13, and I was just like, what just happened? And then I just like burst out laughing, and they kind of looked at me funny because I figured out what was going on and why they were doing it. But it's, you know, again, taking my own experience between the English and the Welsh language was trying to be, you know, they were trying to get rid of it very, very hard. And then the Welsh came back in the 70s and said, no, you know, we need to retain our culture, we need to retain our language, we need to retain our traditions, right? You know, even the women with the big pointy black hats. And you know, there's been a great deal of work to try and revitalize the language, save the culture, save the traditional Welsh stories. And now, I think back then, you know, I totally, you know, on an intellectual level, I understand what you're saying. But now it's like, do we need to preserve these stories still within our own communities, or do you think we should share those stories because of the knowledge that these stories have and pertain? Even though, you know, Wales and England are completely different to New Mexico and Arizona, right? I mean, there's, I don't think there could be much more disparity between the two. But the lessons that you have in a lot of these folk tales and stories and myths, they carry these truisms. And I think that with so many people in the world now, with our cultures so mixed and matched, and certainly for Western European, it's become a very homogenized culture in some ways. And I think the American culture is very similar. It's become homogenized because, like England back in the, early history, we were invaded by the Germans, by the Scandinavians, by the French, and all of those different cultures merged into one to make Britain what it is, right? They say that the original English don't exist anymore, that the original English are in fact the Welsh, and the Welsh moved over to Ireland, and Ireland is filled up with Irish, Welsh, and Scots people, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how much is true of that, but
yeah. Well, it's interesting because coming from the place that I'm coming from, I'm very interested in other people's stories, and I'm interested in basically what you were just talking about. So if I'm interested in your story, why wouldn't somebody be interested in my story? I think the difference is that I noticed and that I honor is that, like, for instance, when you said you walked in and they changed because they didn't recognize you, you looked different, you didn't, so they changed. It was their natural way of protection of who they are. And among the, whether it's Canada all the way down into Mexico and Central America and all of them, so much of who they were.
This ends part 1 of the incredible conversation that Eldrena and I had. Be sure to come back soon for part 2. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, be sure to check out other episodes. And if you think I should interview a certain folk and fairy tale myths and legend storyteller, send me an email. You can find me and my work on Facebook, Simon Brooks Storyteller, and on my website, simonbrooksstoryteller.com, and on Instagram, Simon M. Brooks. Diamond Scree, yep, that's me, the English fella and storyteller. A shout out to Chris Jett for creating and recording and letting me use this wonderful piece of music he created, especially for my podcast. Thanks, Chris. His band is called Blackpool Mecca. Check them out. And they have a new album coming out very soon. You can keep this podcast alive and support my craft by becoming one of my Patreons and paying anything from $1 for an episode that you enjoyed to a regular monthly subscription. In return, you get extras, early release, and exclusive content on my work. That's www.patreon.com/Simon Brooks. If you can't join my wonderful tribe of patrons, then please help me out by doing something you can do. I'll be very grateful if you were to leave a review on Podbean, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find this episode. It doesn't take long, and it helps not just me, but others find and enjoy this podcast. Thanks again for being here with me. I know that there are a lot of other places you could be, and I appreciate it. Until next time, be healthy, be happy, and share the stories you love. Cheers.
It's just a story.